put it in the slot. The weapon you want modified, put it in the slot.
Oh, I get it. You make weapon modifications.
Yep, I can take your puny little weapon, and with a few, tweaks, I can turn it into a powerful piece of equipment. Look, you want me to hook you up or what? I can't hang around here all day.
An often overlooked design element of Ratchet Clank, overshadowed by the other features introduced in Going Commando that later became series mainstays. You've probably thought more about weapon leveling or armor than you ever have about the weapon mod system. But it's been sitting there as well, evolving along with the series, and how it's evolved can often be more interesting than all of those other things. As a little bit of a side feature, not integral to the main experience, there's been a lot of room for experimentation. While weapon leveling was locked into its final form back in 2004 with Up Your Arsenal, the weapon mod system has been flying all over the fucking place, with the current form only being solidified as the main form back in 2013 with Into the Nexus, which was only like 9 years ago. Fuck. So tracking what the fuck is going on with the design of the weapon mod system across the series is actually rather interesting. Now, there's a lot of ground to cover here, although some parts will probably not be as interesting as others, so if your favourite game section is a little short here, it's because there's really not that much to touch on. Well, let's get started then, shall we? Going Commando's weapon mods, as the first system they designed, are naturally not perfect. However, for their first attempt, they got a lot right, so much in fact that I might say that some of the other systems we'll see later might actually constitute as a step back. Like literally everything else in the game, this system is tightly woven into the game's themes, which in Going Commando's case is a move away from the strictly consumeristic threads of the first game into a more broad look at monopolization, corporate greed, and other capitalistic problems that aren't relevant today at all. So, what fits into all of those ideas? Well, black market sales, of course. Slim Cognito is a fan-favourite character alongside his Ship Shack and black market weapon mods, despite only being a set of floating eyes and only appearing in 2 games. It doesn't count. So, that's enough backstory. The weapon mods in Going Commando can be purchased through 3 separate vendors, one on Endako, found if you backtrack the swing shot and grind boot path again once you've collected them, one on Tabora just outside the landing area, and one on Bolden found after the grind rail path. They're bought with Platinum Bolts, the special collectible that replaced Ratchet 1's Gold Bolts, and there's 3 different mods, Lock On, Acid and Shock, and each weapon has pre-selected mods that you can buy. For example, the Lava Gun gets the Acid and Lock On mod, the Lancer gets the Shock and Lock On mod, and so on. They're all fairly self-explanatory. The lock-on mod adds a lock-on feature by holding L2 and R2 that also displays the enemy's health, in a manner reminiscent of Z targeting. The acid mod damages enemies over time, and the shock mod makes weapons act like a mini plasma coil. The mods are pretty cool, but their functions are a little generic, almost certainly being due to being designed to be shared between different weapons, with little to no changes needed to get them to work. And their effect on your weapons is minimal. They don't drastically change their use cases. The sole exception to that, of course, being the Meteor Gun, which is useless without the lock-on mod. That's not actually a terrible thing in concept. For what is effectively an optional mechanic, I don't think they should be vital to the game's balance, but there is something to be said for their lack of impact reducing your drive to sync them out. You can go the entire game completely ignoring them, and you won't really have much more of a difficult time, the mods mainly acting as fun bonuses to weapons rather than as an integral system. They're not as necessary as the ship mods that are also sold by Slim, which without, by the time you get to Planet Gorn, you're in for a real shit time. But it's also important to note that they aren't the sole upgrade system for weapons like the Ship Shack is for space combat, and they're purchased with a finite collectible that are put in deliberately secret locations, rather than as a generic currency like Raritanium is, which while limited to being collected in specific ways, are not absolutely restricted in the same way that Platinum Bolts are. It's in this context that I think it works better, as a fun bonus that supplements the already great weapon leveling system, rather than as another separate weapon progression system. What I do think is great though is how they function to create rewards for collecting Platinum Bolts. In Ratchet 1, Gold Bolts don't really serve a purpose other than as collectibles until pretty late in the game, or even in challenge mode if you miss the vendor on Gimlet Base. Once you have access to them, the gold weapons do serve as a great incentive to collect Gold Bolts, I'd argue the best the series has ever had, but because they can only appear so late in the game, like the mega upgrades that Going Commando replaces them with, they sit pretty uselessly for a large majority of the game. By contrast, the weapon mods in Going Commando, introduced as early as the 3rd full planet and being purchased with Platinum Bolts, means that they pretty much always have a purpose throughout the entire game. That purpose isn't as strong, but it is much more far-reaching, and I think on the whole it is a better incentive than the gold weapons, and certainly what will come later. So not quite vital to the experience, but an interesting addition nonetheless. As a side feature, with only 3 mods to choose from, no option to choose what weapons they go on, and not really affecting the weapon balance at all, they still serve their purpose as a supplement to the optional Platinum Bolt collectible, to create an incentive to collect them, and just as an interesting feature to play with. Honestly, for their first go, it's really well implemented, and probably only topped by one other game, although it would use them in a more integrated way with its weapon progression. But before we get to that, we have to go through the boring one first. In Up Your Arsenal, or as I'll be calling it from now on, Ouya, the weapon mods are actually almost exactly the same as they were in Going Commando. It's just that now they are automatically given to weapons as they level, rather than being an item that you purchase. This decision, like much of the game's design, is a product of limited time. Okay, I can't be sure on that fact, but it seems likely, given that that's exactly how I'd implement them if I was strapped for time, because it's a minimal amount of work for almost the same result as in Going Commando. Skipping the extra development time of having to design a new vendor, figuring out the unlock structure, figuring out where the vendors should be placed, it's a lot more work than you'd probably expect. However, almost the same isn't the same, and I do think that Ouya's implementation falls short of Going Commando's in some small but significant ways. First off, I'm willing to bet that at least a few of you didn't even know that there were even weapon mods in this game. That might sound ridiculous to those that did know, but I can't be sure that I knew when I was playing the game as a kid. I know for sure it took me a long time to start utilizing the lock-on mod, given that you actually have to actively use it, while the rest are just passive upgrades. The only thing that signifies that your weapons have got mods is the help desk message that plays when, from what I can tell, you first unlock a weapon mod, usually the lock-on mod for the shock blaster, or the weapon description text. I honestly thought it was an icon in the weapon menu like it is in Going Commando, but no, it's just this text. I don't know, it doesn't really seem very interesting, does it? I'm struggling to come up with anything to say about these mods because, well, I just spoke about them. They haven't changed anything, they've just removed an element of choice. Now the game's special bolts, titanium bolts, aren't used to purchase mods, they're used to purchase skins. That's cool, I guess, but they don't really affect gameplay. So now these special collectibles don't really have as much of an incentive to collect them as the platinum and gold varieties that they supersede. They're almost not weapon mods at all, they're upgrades, they're just how that weapon functions at that level, and so you don't really engage with them in the same way. They may be the same mods as from Going Commando, but they don't really feel like them. Not because they've changed, but because their context has. By changing a mechanic that was an optional purchase to now be an automatic equip, the mods never present a choice. They can't incentivize you to play any differently, because you have no control over whether a weapon will have a certain mod. The most they can possibly do to incentivize you is to upgrade weapons to unlock their mods, but with the myriad of other factors that also accomplish that makes this not a strong influence, which is definitely not helped by the complete lack of communication on both what mods weapons will get and also what mods they've got. The only reason I feel reasonable analysing them as extensions of the mods in Going Commando is that the small amount of language used to describe them does call them weapon mods. If these functions were just baked into the weapons, even given the direct carryover of their functional design, I wouldn't classify them in the same way. I'm glad that the deliberation around Ouya has shifted to being a little bit more analytical. It seems that the initial and quite long-lasting high praise of the game and subsequent shift into heavy criticism has morphed into a slightly more healthy middle ground. Because the weapon mods, while being direct copies of those from Going Commando, are just one of the parts of Ouya's design that aren't well integrated. But ultimately, their function as a side feature and almost non-existent form of engagement, meaning that they can't actively harm the experience in a way that a lot of the other decisions made under time pressure do. But it's still an aspect of the design that disappoints me a little. At the very least, they got it right next time. Look, I'm gonna be honest, this part of the script sat as a blank document for a long time, because the mod system of Gladiator, or Deadlocked if you're wrong, is really fucking good. But it is also by far the most complex system and a little bit daunting to tackle. So in Gladiator, you've only got 10 weapons, cut in half from Ouya's 20 and even more from Going Commando's 23. But there's a very good reason for this, that being the Alpha and Omega mod system, which is used to take the weapon pool, in which the weapons are a bit generic in their use, although not in their design, and makes the more unique effects dictated by the player. So, the two kinds of mods. First we have Alpha mods, which come in 8 varieties: speed, ammo, aiming, impact, area, jackpot, XP, and healing, the last two being locked to challenge mode. In this game, each weapon levels up to level 10, and for every level, that weapon will unlock an alpha mod slot. So they have 1 at level 1 and 10 at level 10, and whenever a weapon is upgraded, it gets a free alpha mod. So for instance, the Dual Vipers start with 1 alpha mod slot filled with an aiming mod, and when you upgrade it from level 1 to level 2, you will unlock a second alpha mod slot and also get a speed mod to fill it with. Every weapon has its own list of mods it gets for every level, and once you've obtained mods, you can strip them from weapons and apply them to others, effectively customizing the minutiae of their effects. Say you want to take your speed mods off of the Holo Shield launcher, because why do you want speed mods on the Holo Shield launcher, and put them on the Dual Vipers or the Scorpion flail. Or you use one weapon more than another, so you want to take all the ammo mods from one and dump them on another. That's the kind of small changes that alpha mods allow you to do. But what about the big stuff? Well, Omega mods cover those, taking the effects of the more unique weapons from the previous games, like the Infector, the Bouncer, the Liquid Nitrogen Gun, the various morph weapons, as well as the previously used Acid and Shock mods from the previous games, and allows you to add them to any weapon that you choose. Well, there are some restrictions, the Mini Bomb and the Napalm mod only being able to be equipped by explosive weapons, for instance, but for the most part, any Omega mod can be equipped by any weapon. Unlike the alpha mods, they are not earned by upgrading weapons, and are instead a part of the normal bolt economy purchased by standard bolts at regular weapon vendors. And they're not a single-use item like the alpha mods are. Once you've purchased an Omega mod, you can equip it to as many weapons as you'd like. Whew, okay, so that was a lot to go through, but I hope that starts to paint a picture of just how much room you're given to play with. How many unique combinations of mods you can make. You want to chuck 10 speed mods on the Dual Raptors? Yes you do. Or actually 10 speed mods on the Leviathan flail, that's the real fun one. Just fucking go ahead. The only thing that'll stop you from doing that is if you haven't progressed enough to have that many mods or mod slots unlocked. And on that, equipping 10 speed mods means that you can't equip anything else. Yes, there was a point to that. Any mod that you want to equip means that you can't equip another. The more ammo mods you have, the less you have for anything else. You want to have a free slot by removing an aiming mod and just relying on your own aim? You can do that. It's up to you to decide how these mods are going to affect your weapons, and any choice you make means that you're giving up some other option. That's what actually makes it interesting. It's not the amount of options that you have, but rather the limitations that those options bring. Unlike before, where the mods are additive, and the only decision is whether or not you'll buy them, Gladiator's mods present choices. By adapting your weapons in one way, you are directly making them worse in another. And it's because of that what mods you'll equip is always an interesting choice. And not only that, they also improve the progression that the previous mods struggled to have. The alpha mods more directly contribute to the direct usefulness of your weapons in ways that the previous mods don't, by affecting attributes like ammo or the auto aim or area of effect. Sure, it does have to remove a portion of the progression from the actual weapon leveling to accomplish that, as leveling up a weapon no longer does anything other than increase its damage, but I feel that it also adding a new alpha mod slot to your pool is more than enough of a substitute for that. And by the time weapon leveling becomes mostly meaningless, that being in challenge mode once most of your weapons are already at max level, the alpha mods are added to regular vendors for purchase. But we're yet to talk about the Omega mods, the other half of Gladiator's mod system, the more analogous one to Going Commando and Ouya's mod systems. They've even appropriated the Shock and Acid mods from those games for 2 of the Omega mods. What's interesting is that the Omega mods are actually the less consequential half of the mod system, despite being mostly a direct parallel. Instead of being linked to some other part of the game like weapon leveling or special bolts, they're just part of the same bolt economy used to purchase most other stuff in the game. Alongside that, they don't act as a finite resource in the same way that alpha mods do. They instead are more like permanent upgrades. When one is purchased, it can be applied to as many weapons as you want, so by their nature, you never have to strategize on deciding what Omega mods to choose. That sounds like a critique, and maybe it is a little, but I think it works regardless. We already have one part of the system that takes that role. I think having another would be perhaps a touch excessive. Alpha mods are about strategy and choice, and the Omega mods are about having your guns shoot napalm. They get to be a little bit more dramatic, becoming the Bouncer is a little bit more visually interesting than shoots faster. It's not as intellectually interesting, but it's not trying to be. And due to the nature of the weapon pool, they can be applied to every weapon, something that we have never and will never see again. And what that means is that they can consolidate some of the interesting weapons that weren't well integrated into the combat of the prior games. Stuff like the Infector, the Sheepinator a little bit, and the Quackery especially, the Bouncer, which is well integrated, but probably wouldn't be in this game's combat, and you can apply their unique effects to any weapons you choose. It makes you much more likely to actually use these effects. I can tell you for sure I've pretty much never used the Infector, and sure, the Brainwash mod is probably not my first choice in Gladiator, but I'm definitely about 1,000,000,000% more likely to use it because I can apply it to the fucking Scorpion flail. God, this game is good. Sure, people have warmed up to it in recent years, but you fuckers haven't warmed up to it enough. Look, I get that it lacks variety and that it's so front-loaded that it's a miracle it doesn't tip over and fall off a cliff, but my god, that combat design is amazing. It's the first, and I'd argue the only time, where the mod system has been properly integrated into the core combat. It somehow elevates this game, worked on by a fraction of the team with a fraction of the time as the previous two, and gives it the best combat system out of all of its predecessors. The best in the series, depending on how you feel about Rift Apart. It's certainly my favourite, not game, just combat system, and it's definitely the best we'll ever see the weapon mods. Although the next one will be interesting. Well, it isn't the next one, but it is the next one, you'll see. I'm going to do a little bit of a time jump to 2009 to coincidentally talk about the game About Time. That's not actually the reason, that'll make sense when I get back to tools, but for now, let's look at a crack in time. In lieu of Gladiator's Omega and Alpha mod systems, Crack in Time instead chooses to limit its mod system to 3 weapons, the Constructor Pistol, Bomb Glove and Shotgun. It's an interesting system, flawed in some ways, not the least being the fact above that it's limited to a 1/6 of the weapon pool, but it's also a lot more interesting than what will come, and I guess also what has come before. It definitely has its strengths. Constructo mods are probably the most effect that weapon mods have had on the actual function of the weapons in the series. Because, instead of being framed as mostly a form of progression as the weapon mods from Going Commando and Ouya were, it expands on the way that Gladiator's mods were used as a customizability feature, and makes that pretty much the sole purpose of Constructo mods. Each Constructo weapon has 3 categories that have 3 mods each, affecting different aspects of the weapons, something to do with firing, something to do with the projectile being fired, and something to do with the lingering effects of the projectile, and for each category, you can only equip one of the 3 mods. The choice of limiting each category to only one of the 3 options creates a system that's not about being better, not so absolutely a system of progression in the same way that the others were, but rather a system of adaptation. None of the mods in any one category are inherently better than another, at least with a surface inspection, so you don't pick any one mod over another because of its inherent quality, rather to fit a specific combat situation or playstyle. For example, I usually keep the Constructor Shotgun on the choke barrel because I like to focus single enemies at a time, but facing against a swarm of small enemies, either of the other 2 are much more effective. The Constructo mods change the actual function of the weapon, not acting as supplemental functionality like all of the previous systems, but by fundamentally changing the way that the weapon handles and its use cases. Just aside from being their own collectible, not tied to special bolts or weapon leveling or the bolt economy in the same way that the others were, this is what makes them not a tool of progression, but a tool of customization, an interesting mechanic around crafting weapons to your own design, while still not losing their unique designs and functionality in the process. Unfortunately, this is where reality comes in, and we have to acknowledge that this idea is not fully realised, that while it's a very interesting system, it's unlikely that you'll engage with it enough for those design decisions to take hold. For one, there's the main point from above, that it only affects 3 out of the 18 available weapons, one of which isn't actually available at normal vendors, and it's very possible you'll miss it. It would have been impossible for them to have made 6 unique mod designs for every weapon in the time that they had, the first 3 of the 9 being the weapon's standard operation. That would total to 108 collectible Constructo mods, and a Crack in Time just doesn't have the space to fit all of them in. However, that doesn't change the fact that a system affecting such a small portion of the weapon pool means that it's a system you're not likely to engage with very often, especially as the weapons, 2/3 of which are the ones you start the game with, get outclassed by the more powerful weapons in the mid to late game. The Constructo Shotgun is the only weapon that stays useful throughout the game, almost certainly due to its introduction in the mid game. There's also the fact that one of the key designs of the Constructo mods, that being adapting weapons to certain situations, isn't well utilised when doing that is locked behind a bunch of menu use. It's not quick or efficient to swap Constructo mods on the fly, so you'll most likely just find the ones that you like the most and stick with them for the entire game. It's possible that something like custom loadouts could have fixed this, but that could have also been pretty functionally close to just having them all active at once. So it's difficult to determine what a good solution for this would be. That's why I said before that the Constructo mods all appear to be of a similar usefulness only on a surface inspection, because while that might be technically true, different players will find some much more useful than others, and because they'll almost certainly stick to one choice the entire game, you'll only ever use the ones that are best for you, and so their purpose becomes no different to the mods from Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal. The different barrels of the shotgun might technically all be of a similar usefulness, but I'm only ever going to use the choke barrel because to me, it's much more useful than any of the other ones. Maybe that's also a more broad comment on the combat design only accommodating specific use cases that some of the Constructo mods are not equipped to handle, but I think that'd be a critique of specific mods rather than the system as a whole. Regardless, it's still very clear that, while interesting, the Constructo mods needed a lot more time in the oven. Time that they didn't have, but time that they definitely needed. You see, the Constructor mods, similar to Gladiator, are clearly a core part of the design. They're not like a fringe feature like they were in Going Commando and Ouya, but they function as one with their relatively limited impact and small size of effective weapons. They can't ever affect your decisions in the same way that the Alpha and Omega mods can. But that doesn't mean that there aren't some really interesting ideas to draw from here. Changing the fundamental purpose of weapons beyond just how fast they fire or how much ammo they have is a concept that, with enough time to scope it to affect the game in a more substantial way, to be better accommodated into the game's combat, it could be built into the best mod system that we've ever seen, reaching even beyond the heights of Gladiator. Unfortunately for us, history will not see it that way. Alright, let's wind back the clock a bit. We're risking a little bit more than 6 minutes and we're going back 2 years to Tools of Destruction. Those bright folks among you might have already realised why I ordered the games in this way, although the chapter title probably already gave it away. Tools of Destruction's Raritanium upgrade tree, which is the closest analogue the game has to a weapon mod system, has been carried into every game that followed, minus A Crack in Time. Which is a shame really, because I think any of the other weapon mod systems would make for a much better foundation to build on than the Raritanium upgrade tree. All of the other ones, except maybe Ouya, have much more interesting designs to work with. Now, I don't think that you can adapt Gladiator's Alpha and Omega mod system into newer Ratchet design wholesale, but I'd prefer it over this borderline padding. Yeah, if you couldn't tell already, I'm not a fan of the Raritanium tree upgrade system. I'm sorry Mike, it's just not good. It goes a step even beyond Ouya and is not only unengaging, but it actively makes the experience worse. Okay, let me cool down for a second and actually explain what the system is. So, in weapon vendors, there is a second menu for each weapon with an upgrade tree. Each weapon has its own unique upgrade tree where you can only purchase upgrades adjacent to the ones that you've already purchased. They're purchased with a Raritanium, previously used as the currency for ship upgrades in Going Commando, now repurposed to purchase these mods, found in various ways depending on the game. The effects of the mods are similar to the Alpha mods from Gladiator, upgrading ammo, area of effect, that kind of deal, with more substantial upgrades similar to the Omega mods, although usually not as impactful, dedicated to these special mods that are grayed out and only unlocked when you purchase every upgrade that surrounds it. On the surface, this seems pretty similar to Gladiator's mod system, so you might be wondering what the big deal is. Well, what it comes down to is a shift in context. In the same way that Ouya shifts its context to make weapon mods something you earn rather than something you buy, the Raritanium tree shifts the system to only be about progression rather than also being a customizability tool. Sure, they may both be about upgrading the minor stats of weapons, but when it's just another thing to keep track of to make sure that the weapons are as strong as they can be, it becomes less compelling. You don't really engage with it in the same way. It's much more akin to busy work, going to a vendor to spend all of your Raritanium because, well, that's just what you should do. They fail to be exciting in the same way that the Alpha mods are, despite being so similar, because there is no choice. Do I want to have more ammo on this weapon in exchange for more speed or area of effect? That's never a question you'll ask yourself. The only question you'll ever ask is, do I purchase the ammo mods first and don't care about everything else? To which the answer is yes, you will say that because that's what you'll do. It's not a meaningful choice if you don't give up something else when you choose, but it's trying to be the same by having so many mods to choose from and making the upgrade path a tree. That's why I don't mind Going Commando and Ouya's mods not really having any kind of choice in the same way that Gladiators and A Crack in Times do, because they're trying to accomplish something else. They're not about presenting choices, they're about incentivizing you to do something else, either collect platinum bolts or whatever the fuck is happening in Ouya. This upgrade tree is a little bit similar, where the activity it incentivizes you to do is collect Raritanium, but by being a tree, it's trying to pretend to present you a choice. This might be a more general gripe on upgrade tree design because it's a style of design that pretends to be about choice, but it's instead about grinding. It doesn't really matter what options you choose in the short term, when in the long term you'll just have everything. In Tools of Destruction, it really isn't that bad. The almost timid design of each weapon's upgrade tree means that the grindy nature of an upgrade tree is mitigated, something that won't last long, as even Into the Nexus, the second time the system is used, we can see the trees already ballooning to massive size. I can only imagine that the reason for this is that the consequences of just adding more mods, making it bigger, wasn't properly considered. Which is an interesting choice given the generally smaller scale that Nexus has, which, while horribly paced, manages to make that smaller scale work quite well. By adding so many mods, the process of buying them is less compelling because each one's effect has to be diminished in order to not have them completely shatter the difficulty balance, and therefore purchasing them doesn't hold anywhere close to the same amount of weight. It becomes a grind, where you purchase them not to make a choice, not because you want to see some effect, but because you're trying to make a number go up. You want a tree to be filled. It's no longer about what the upgrade actually entails, but only about the process of buying them. Incredibly ironic, given that this blind obsession with mindless consumption, with progress for the sake of progress, is exactly the kind of thing that the series started as a satire of. Yeah, that is one major oof, isn't it? It's why I find the system borderline harmful, because it represents a lack of thought to how it makes the games more grindy, to how it doesn't present meaningful choices, to a corruption of ideas over time, but mainly to how its lack of change represents a level of complacency. Okay, that was a bit of a downer section to end on, so to bring us up to a lighter note, the way that the mods have evolved, even including the Raritanium mods, is an interesting bit of design history. When series go on for this long, most of their design evolution looks linear, and we can even see that in a lot of Ratchet design. Like, going from Going Commando to Rift Apart, you can visibly see how slowly and linearly the combat is being refined. Weapon mods aren't linear at all. There's experimentation, an attempt to make unique designs that the studio hadn't done before, to take their previous work and drastically change it to fit whatever project they were working on, while still maintaining the essence of what came before. That's what makes them so interesting, and why them now settling on what they've built is a little disappointing. It's not because I don't like the Raritanium mod system. That's not what bothers me, I can live with that. What really bothers me is the lack of innovation, of willingness to experiment, to try new things, and to not be afraid of failure. If you look at the 5 systems we've looked at today, they have a hit rate of less than 50%. They haven't worked more than they have. But interesting and not quite successful are not mutually exclusive. What's interesting about the weapon mods is not their overall quality, but their evolution, and how when they hit hard. It's a lesson in experimentation, in how it doesn't always work, but not doing the same, creating new ideas, is where the best design comes from.